It was the winter of the year, 603. And within the cold stone walls of Richmond Palace, the silence had changed. It was no longer the silence of reverence or protocol. It was the silence of dread. Those who had once laughed loudly in her presence now barely whispered. And the great halls that had echoed with court music and the rustle of silk now trembled with a different rhythm, the rasp of a woman's breath. Shallow and halting. Behind gilded doors, no one dared open without trembling. For nearly half a century, Elizabeth had stood as the very image of majesty, the Virgin Queen, untouched by time, unbent by grief, unbroken by war. But in those final days, it was not her enemies who brought her down. It was her own reflection. The face beneath the crown was not the one England had loved. Her portraits, those grand, ethereal lies, had shown a woman glowing with divine beauty. Her skin smooth and untouched. Her gaze steady and serene. But what lay beneath the layers of paint and paste was no longer recognizably human. Her skin, once admired for its porcelain sheen, was now a map of scars. Weeping sores, and ash-colored blotches that even her most trusted ladies could barely conceal. The white mask she wore was not merely makeup, it was armor. And every morning, it had to be repainted with trembling hands and careful deception. Not to protect her from the world, but to protect the world from what she had become. Elizabeth had lived a life carved from steel and stained glass. She had outlived rivals, traitors, lovers, and even her own blood. She had defeated the Spanish Armada, crushed rebellions, and watched flames consume those who whispered against her reign. Yet the final enemy she could not conquer was the creeping rot that rose from within her, one spoonful of sugar, one drop of lead, one layer of vermilion at a time. Her beauty regime, hailed by nobles and copied by courtiers, had become her slow executioner. The ceruse she painted on her skin, thick white paste made of vinegar and powdered lead, had seeped through her pores and sunk into her bones. The vermilion on her cheeks was mercury. The belladonna in her eyes was poison. Every effort to stay young was one more nail in her coffin. And she knew it. She knew what was happening. That was the horror. This was not the innocent decay of age, but the cold, lucid awareness of self-destruction. Her fingertips trembled not just from time, but from mercury madness. Her mind, once a weapon sharper than any sword, was beginning to betray her. In the mirror, when she dared to look, and she saw not a queen, but a corpse. There came a time when she had all mirrors removed from her chambers, too afraid to meet her own eyes, too disgusted by what stared back. The courtiers whispered of her new paranoia, of her screaming fits in the night, of her refusal to eat or sleep or be touched. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that she wasn't losing her mind. She was fighting to keep it, clinging to it with bloodied nails, while the poison gnawed at every thought, every nerve, every inch of flesh. The teeth fell out first. Her love of sweets, confections soaked in honey, sugared oranges, marzipan roses had been charming in her youth, decadent in her middle years, and catastrophic. By the time she reached 60, infection bloomed in her jaw, abscesses swelled, and the stench of rot forced ambassadors to stand at a distance. She refused the barber surgeons and their hooks, their pliers, their bone-cracking extractions. She had watched men scream and faint from their work. She would not scream. She would not faint. And so, instead, she stuffed fabric into her cheeks to maintain the illusion of fullness, to keep her voice from whistling through missing teeth. When that no longer worked, She stopped smiling altogether. Even her most loyal attendants flinched at the rawness beneath the rouge, at the trembling hands trying to hold the scepter steady. One day, one of the younger maids knew, unaware, fainted upon seeing the queen's naked face. She was never seen again. Another, older and wiser, claimed in her private journal that her dreams were haunted by the sight of Elizabeth's skin, unpainted, cracked like pottery, bleeding at the edges, flaking in strips that revealed yellowed flesh beneath. She said the queen wept in the mornings, quietly, with her back turned, and then demanded silence before the first brushstroke of ceruse touched her cheek. Behind every public appearance was a ritual of agony. Her wigs had to be tied to what remained of her hair, now gray and brittle, in a way that would not tear open the scabs hidden beneath. Her gowns had to be tightened to give her wasted frame the illusion of strength. Every stitch, every jewel, every layer of lace was a calculated deception. Her voice was softer now, rasped by pain and infection. Her eyes watered constantly, not from grief, but from the belladonna. Her hands were often gloved, hiding the shaking and the blackened fingernails. She smiled rarely, and when she did, it was without joy, without warmth, just the tightening of muscles beneath layers of painted death. This was the truth of the Virgin Queen in her final years, a woman who had once ruled an empire through sheer charisma and iron will, now held together by powder, pins, and pride. A woman who had outlived every rival, but could not outlive the poison she wore like perfume. And yet she continued. She sat in council. She signed edicts. She received ambassadors, all while knowing that her body was collapsing under the weight of her own legend. They say she chose this, that she refused to ever appear weak, that she rejected every suggestion to abandon the cosmetics, that even in the face of agony, she whispered, "Paint me. They must not see." And so, they painted her. They painted a ghost and dressed her in gold. They bowed to a shell. They served a dream wrapped in silk. By the spring of 603, her time was nearly gone. But she would not lie down. Not yet. She remained seated on the floor of her chamber, draped in velvet, surrounded by fading tapestries and flickering candles, staring at nothing, waiting for a death that took its time. In those final weeks, the mask began to crack. Her voice mumbled strange names. She spoke to her mother, to Anne Boleyn, to the father who beheaded her. She wept, then laughed, then whispered secrets no one could understand. Her body twitched with fever. Her mind wandered through blood and memory. But still, she wore the crown, and when she finally died, on the 24th of March, in the year 603, she died as a queen, not as a woman, not as herself. The mask was never lifted, even in death. They painted her one last time, because England never saw the nightmare beneath the crown. But now, you will. Each morning began in silence, not the peace of a sleeping palace, but the kind of silence that thickens the air before a scream. Within Elizabeth's private apartments, long before the courtiers were allowed to stir or the great hall began to hum with politics, a different kind of ritual unfolded. The Queen's ladies rose before the sun. They moved barefoot over rush-covered floors, whispering like ghosts, their hands trembling as they prepared the tools of transformation jars of ceruse, brushes made of boar hair, a silver bowl of vinegar, crushed pearls, powdered lead, cloth strips soaked in rosewater to hold back nausea. These were not the instruments of beauty. These were weapons, and they were preparing for war. Elizabeth's dressing chamber was no longer a place of finery and fragrance. It had become a battlefield. And every morning she waged war against her own face. The young maids who attended her had once dreamed of becoming ladies of the chamber, imagining they would braid golden hair, lace fine corsets, and perhaps catch a favor from the queen's own lips. What they found instead was something far darker. They were not beauticians. They were undertakers. What they uncovered beneath the queen's night veil each dawn was not the face of majesty, but the decaying canvas of a monarch slowly being devoured by her own legend. The queen sat still on a cushioned stool, always in silence. Eyes closed, hands gripped white against the arms. Her breathing was shallow. Her body, once strong enough to ride horses through the mud at Tilbury, had withered into bone beneath her silks. Her cheeks, long ago hollowed by time and toothache, had to be stuffed with wads of scented fabric before any pigment could be applied. Her skin was raw from the night's sleep. The act of removing the previous day's ceruse was an agony in itself, scraped gently off with warm cloths and vinegar. It pulled with it flakes of skin, bits of scab, and sometimes fresh blood. No one spoke during this process. To speak was to risk the queen hearing the tremor in your voice. Ceruse, also called spirits of Saturn or Venetian white, was the most prized cosmetic in the court. It gave the appearance of perfection, pale, flawless, noble. But it was made from white lead mixed with vinegar, and it had been killing Elizabeth slowly for decades. The more damage it did, the more she needed it. Her face had become addicted to the mask. The scarring from repeated applications meant the base had to be applied thicker, heavier, more completely. There were days, especially in the colder months, when the skin around her temples cracked open beneath the layer of paint. On those days, the ladies would gently press beeswax into the wounds before applying the lead, sealing infection beneath a second skin. What haunted the ladies most wasn't the smell of decay or the sight of leaking sores. It was Elizabeth's composure. She never flinched, never complained, never opened her eyes as they painted over the rot. She knew what was being hidden, what they were forced to witness, but she refused to acknowledge it. It was as though her soul had retreated deep into the crown of her skull, leaving behind only a husk, one that had a job to do, an image to preserve, a myth to maintain. To serve that myth was the sacred duty of her maids. And they did. Even as their hands shook, even as they grew pale, even as they began to whisper of nightmares that clung to them long after the day's duties were done. The younger girls were the most affected. Many were daughters of noblemen, gifted to the queen's service as a mark of loyalty. They were told it was an honor, but no one warned them what it meant to look directly at a legend undone. The first time they saw her face unpainted, most were told to stare at the floor, to keep their mouths shut, to imagine they were blind. A few disobeyed. One girl, not more than 14, gasped when she saw the queen's cheeks, deep purple welts beneath the gray paste, ulcers at the edges of her lips, the outline of her jaw, a sickly green beneath weeping blisters. Elizabeth heard the breath. She turned slowly, and the girl, poor thing, dropped the jar of rouge and fainted dead away. She was dismissed the same evening. Others fared better older, perhaps, or more practiced at disassociation. They learned to think of the queen as a statue, something sacred and untouchable. They whispered prayers as they applied the ceruse, not for her soul, but for the strength to finish their work. A few went mad in quieter ways. One, it said, began scraping her own face at night. convinced that she too was infected, that her beauty would soon rot from her like the queen's. Another vanished entirely, last seen weeping at the chapel altar, asking the Virgin Mary to forgive her for covering death with paint. And yet, despite the horror, there was something magnetic about it. Elizabeth's presence, even when disfigured, remained overpowering. She would speak little during the painting, but her silence had gravity. It pulled everything toward her. There was a sense unspoken, but deeply felt that even in ruin, she was majestic. The mask was not simply a deception, it was a final act of defiance. A rotting woman commanding the world to see a goddess, and the world obeyed. When the painting was done, when every sore was hidden, when the lips had been shaped with crushed cinnabar, and the cheeks gently powdered into a poisonous bloom, Elizabeth would rise without thanks or glance. She would look into the empty frame where a mirror had once hung, nod once, and then move toward the day's audience. No matter the agony in her joints, no matter the swelling in her jaw or the tremor in her limbs, she walked like a queen. The illusion was perfect from afar. Only those who had seen the base understood what held it all together. Outside the chamber, no one dared question the queen's appearance. To do so was to risk banishment. Rumor swirled, of course, but none dared speak of the mask openly. The court painters understood the unspoken rules. Every portrait must show the Virgin Queen as eternally young, eternally untouched, eternally divine. To paint her otherwise was treason by brushstroke, even as her face in person grew more rigid, more mask-like. Her official portraits remained ageless, serene, powerful. It was a lie that the entire kingdom conspired to uphold. And so, the days passed, and the ceruse thickened. Her skin could no longer breathe. Her body could no longer sweat. The infections beneath the surface multiplied. And every morning, the ladies of the chamber gathered again, prepared the same tools, and held their breath as they uncovered the ruin and remade the image. There was no rest from this ritual. Not for Elizabeth. Not for the girls. Not for the mask. They say near the end, as her health faltered and her mind began to crack beneath the weight of pain and poison, she whispered strange things during the painting. Half-formed apologies. Names long dead. Pleas to Anne. To Mary. To the mother she never knew. Once, a lady swore she heard the Queen murmur, "I buried myself years ago. All this is just burial makeup." But no one ever asked her to explain, because deep down, they already knew. She had once been praised for her eloquence, her charm, her voice that could still a storm in Parliament or coax laughter from hardened courtiers. But by the time Elizabeth reached her 60th year, the voice had begun to change, not in tone or in purpose, but in the shape of the sounds themselves. Certain syllables became sharp, others hissed where they once rang, and gradually, the words of a queen began to carry the echoes of something broken inside her mouth. What had once been speech became struggle. What had once been wit became whispers. And behind every word was a scream she could not afford to let out. The horror of Elizabeth's teeth did not begin with infection. It began with pleasure. Sweetness was the gateway. And for a queen who had spent her youth starved of affection, sugar was the one seduction she never refused. She indulged in candied violets, preserved cherries, syruped figs, and elaborate sculpted marzipan brought from the New World. To offer Elizabeth a sugared confection was to gain a smile. To fill her table with sweetmeats was to earn a glance of approval. and by her 40th year, she was consuming enough sugar to rot the mouth of any commoner in half the time. But Elizabeth was no commoner, and her body had been trained to serve the crown before itself. When her teeth began to ache, she dismissed it. When they loosened, she denied it. When they blackened and cracked, she did what she always did. She painted over it, powdered her lips, and continued to speak as if nothing had changed. But things had changed. By the time she reached 50, she was already missing several teeth. Her breath was bitter with decay, and courtiers learned to stand half a step farther back during audiences, disguising their discomfort with elegant bows. The rot was slow, creeping, and cruel. Abscesses formed in her gums, small at first, then larger, more swollen, purple and hot with pus. The pain was constant. It drilled into the bone and radiated across her face, down her neck, into her ears, into her sleep. On the worst days, she could not eat. She would wave away her food with trembling hands, or order it reduced to broth. The ladies of the chamber learned to cut soft fruit into slivers and place them carefully upon her tongue, as if feeding a child. There were days she could not chew, days she could not even swallow. Yet never did she show this in public. Never did she confess the pain. She smiled with closed lips. She pressed cloth between her gums and cheeks to mimic the fullness she had lost. And she continued to perform. The smell, they said, was the worst of it. Infection has a scent of its own, sweet, sickly, and unmistakable. Despite the burning of incense and the application of perfumed pomanders, the air around Elizabeth was tainted by the rot within her mouth. Her pillows bore the marks of it. Her linen soaked the drainage. Servants who had to launder her bedclothes did so in silence, offering no commentary beyond tightly drawn lips and pale eyes. Only the closest attendants, those who dared approach her at dawn. I knew the extent of the damage. Gums swollen like bruised fruit, teeth dangling by threads of infected flesh, open pockets of pus that oozed when she spoke. They swore never to speak of it outside those rooms. But some wrote, and what they wrote paints a picture not of vanity, but of silent agony. Tooth extraction was the only solution, but Elizabeth feared it more than death. In an age before anesthesia, dental surgery was nothing short of torture. The barber surgeons used iron tools, brute strength, and prayer. They would twist the tooth from the socket, often breaking it, and sometimes taking pieces of the jaw with it. Infection after extraction was common, and many died not from rot, but from the cure. Elizabeth knew this. She had seen it happen, and so she refused the surgeon's hand. Again and again, she refused, until the pain became unbearable. There was one account recorded by her bishop in the year 1578 that Elizabeth was in such agony she could not eat or speak without crying. The surgeon arrived, tools in hand, and she sent him away. Only when the Bishop of London, an old and faithful man, offered to have one of his own healthy teeth pulled in her presence, did she finally relent. She watched him endure the pain without flinching, then nodded once to the surgeon. That day, one of her own teeth was removed. Her screams were heard across the palace. It was said she wept for hours after, not from the pain of the jaw, but from the terror of what she knew would come again. And it did. Over the next 2 decades, more teeth fell or were taken. By the final years of her life, Elizabeth's jaw was hollow, and her speech was altered permanently. She developed a lisp, a faint whistle, when she said certain consonants. a slurring of vowels she had once pronounced, like poetry. At first, she attempted to compensate, speaking more slowly, more deliberately, emphasizing only the words she knew would come clean. But over time, it became too difficult, too humiliating. She began to speak less. Her written notes to advisors increased. Her personal conversation diminished. There were even days she said nothing at all. But this was not only a medical crisis, this was a political one. A queen who could not speak was a queen perceived as weak. And so, new tactics were developed. Wax was shaped to fill her gums. Cloth pads were tucked into her cheeks to mimic the lines of youth. Every word she uttered in public was rehearsed. Every smile she gave was rehearsed. Even her silence was rehearse-timed, poised, constructed like a theatrical performance in a collapsing theater. The worst of it came during one of her final court ceremonies. She had not been seen in weeks. Rumors whispered through corridors that her jaw had swollen shut, that she had screamed through the night, that she was spitting blood into cloth. And then, one morning, she appeared in the hall dressed in crimson, face powdered to perfection, mouth fixed in a strange, tight, half-smile. Those who were close enough could see the slight bulge in her cheeks, could hear the way her breath wheezed through her teeth, or what remained of them. But no one said a word. The court applauded her radiance. They bowed to the performance. They bowed to the mask. Behind the mask, the queen was dying, if not in body. Then, in the function that had once defined her, her voice, and she felt the loss of that voice more deeply than she ever admitted. Her tongue, her wit, her ability to cut through counsel with a single phrase, these had been her weapons for decades. Now, dulled by infection and absence, they were turning against her. There were days she sat in her chamber, staring at the words she had written, unable to speak them aloud. Words she once hurled like daggers now remained caged behind lips she could no longer part. When she slept, which was rare, she dreamed of her teeth, dreams of biting into apples and feeling them crumble, dreams of speaking in parliament and hearing only the sound of wind between gaps, dreams of her enemies laughing as her jaw fell open, revealing nothing but rot. She would wake with hands pressed to her mouth, breath shallow, heart racing. And yet, despite all this, she never surrendered. She never allowed the surgeons to extract what remained. She never allowed the court to see her without her fillers and cloths. She refused soft diets in public. She insisted on attending counsel, even if it meant sitting in silence while others spoke. Her mouth may have betrayed her, but her will did not. The teeth screamed in silence, day after day. And Elizabeth endured every cry, not because she had no choice, but because she had made the choice long ago to be a queen first, and a woman last. The mirror had long been banished, not because it cracked, but because it told the truth. There was no room for truth in the queen's chamber now, only ritual, only concealment. And under the thick white paint, beneath the silks and the scent of crushed violets and rosewater, Elizabeth's skin was no longer skin. It was a battlefield, not a place of past wounds, but a living and bleeding war zone where infection never ceased, and pain wrote its name in open sores that refused to scab. They came like traitors in the night, quiet, persistent, growing from nothing into raw, weeping pits of rot, and they never left. What began as blemishes, tiny red dots beneath her powder, became lesions, then ulcers, then wounds that bled beneath her jawline, down her neck, across the curve of her cheek. Sometimes they clustered, other times They erupted one by one like stars collapsing. Some bled clear fluid. Some oozed yellow. And every morning, they were cleaned, repainted, sealed beneath lead and pearl dust and venom-colored rouge. The ladies in waiting, sworn to silence, dabbed them with cloth soaked in rose vinegar and crushed myrrh. They whispered prayers they did not believe. They held back gags as they pressed down on inflamed tissue and watched the queen's lips tremble, her eyes blinking against the pain but never flinching, never cursing, never once asking for mercy. The physicians called them cankers, the catch-all word for any wound they did not understand. But they understood this much: they were not healing. They were multiplying. They left behind pockmarks and hardened tissue, skin that flaked off in pale ribbons, or burst open again when she laughed too wide, or clenched her jaw in one of her silent rages. The more they tried to treat them, the worse they became. Ointments made from lard and crushed herbs, poultices of burned barley and honey, even pastes of ground pearl mixed with deer suet, all failed. And still, the cosmetics were applied. There was no choice. The queen had made it clear nothing would touch her skin unless it preserved the mask. When her doctors began to suspect that the very paint on her face was poisoning her, they offered gentle suggestions, perhaps fewer applications, perhaps a single day without it. She said nothing. The next day, those physicians were replaced. Ceruse, the sacred white mask of lead and vinegar, was eating her alive. It had long passed the point of vanity. It was addiction now, a chemical and psychological need to hold the image in place, no matter the cost. And the cost was steep. The skin beneath the mask no longer breathed. The pores were clogged, suffocated by metal dust and animal fat and sweat that could not escape. Cuts that would have once healed in days festered for weeks. Blisters hardened into calluses, then cracked open again. Her hands, too, once soft and adorned with rings, were now gloved more often than bare, hiding the scars, the scabs, the reddened rash from years of handling the same toxic materials that covered her face. Sometimes, the wounds would pulse. That's how the younger ladies described it, pulsing, like small hearts beneath the skin, beating against the fabric, as if the queen's body was trying to speak through the only voice it had left. On the worst days, the ulcers would leak through the paint before the end of a royal audience. It happened once during a meeting with a French ambassador. A thin streak of yellow seeped from beneath her left eye and slid down her cheek. Elizabeth did not blink. She raised a gloved hand, wiped it away with the sleeve, and continued speaking as if nothing had happened. The ambassador said nothing. What could he say? But he never requested another audience. Every brushstroke became more dangerous. Every morning, the act of painting her was a gamble. Would the lead paste close the wounds or tear them open again? Would the pressure of the powder puff rupture the fresh scab beneath her ear? Would a simple kiss to her own shoulder from a shift being fastened tear the skin away in a clean, wet line? And if it did, what then? The ladies had learned to pack small pads of cotton, soaked in camphor and clove oil, tucking them into their sleeves like weapons. When the bleeding came, they would press gently, whispering, "Hold still, Majesté," even as her fingers dug into the chair arms. And still, she insisted on attending court, on dancing, on showing herself, if only briefly to remind them all that she was not broken. Her face, once described in songs and poetry, was now an illusion, painted fresh each dawn. From a distance, she still looked divine. The portraits continued to arrive from the workshops, impossible images of eternal youth, with no shadows beneath the eyes, No folds in the skin. No hint of the battlefield beneath the crown. The myth lived on. But the woman behind the myth, she was becoming something else. Elizabeth began to refuse sleep. She claimed the nightmares were growing louder. In truth, she feared the hours in which her skin was bare. The hours in which no paint shielded her from her own reflection. She would pace her chambers at night. A thin figure in a robe of black velvet. Her hands trembling from the pain in her knuckles. Her jaw twitching from the pressure of an abscess. No one dared glance. She spoke aloud to those who were no longer alive. Sometimes she whispered. Sometimes she shouted. Her ladies heard her speak to her mother Anne, who had died before Elizabeth could remember her. She asked her if beauty had been worth it. Then she would fall silent again, walking in circles like a ghost that had not yet found the grave. In her final winters, the ulcers spread across her collarbone and shoulders. Her gowns had to be padded with silk on the inside to keep the seams from scraping the open skin. There were days when the scabs bled through the fabric, but she continued to wear her stiffest bodices, her highest ruffs, her heaviest jewelry. They were armor now. She did not remove her earrings. Even though the lobes were cracked and sometimes bled, she refused to forego her corsets, even as they rubbed against raw flesh. To compromise would be to admit the wounds were real, and she had never been one to surrender. Even the dying roses on her windowsill were changed more often than the Queen's routines. Her physicians grew disparate. Some attempted to leach the infection. Others insisted on burning the wounds with hot iron to seal them shut. One even recommended a ritual purification, using goat's blood and gold dust. Elizabeth listened to, each with a quiet that was more terrifying than rage. And then she dismissed them all. They were not healers. They were men trying to rename the inevitable. She knew what was happening to her. Her skin was rejecting the mask, but the mask could not be removed. And then, one morning, she did not rise. The sores beneath her chin had bled during the night. Her sheets were stained. Her pillows smelled of pus and paint. Her ladies gathered around her and waited, but she did not call for paint. She did not ask for rouge or cyrus. She only sat, leaning her back against the headboard, her eyes open and vacant. And then, softly, she whispered, "Let them rot. They're not mine anymore." But by evening, she was at the mirror again, one she had demanded returned. And once more, she allowed them to paint her, because the sores may have been real, but the myth was immortal. There are poisons that stain the body, and there are poisons that haunt the mind. Elizabeth, Queen of England, had long learned to live with the former ATO. She had made a kingdom of her pain, built a throne upon the white dust of Circe, and ruled from behind a mask of lead and silk. But no kingdom survives once the mind begins to falter. And in her last decade of life, Elizabeth's final war was not against Spain, not against Parliament, not against enemies, foreign or domestic. It was against shadows, against whispers, against a growing storm inside her skull that no crown could silence. The first signs were small, almost unnoticeable to anyone not already watching for them. She would forget names, pause during sentence, struggle to recall the order of events in a meeting she had called herself. Her advisors dismissed it as fatigue. Her ladies blamed lack of sleep, but those closest to her, those who had seen the flesh rot from her jaw, who had wrapped infected hands in silk gloves, who had painted her face every morning for 30 years, they saw something else, something darker. The look in her eyes, when she saw someone familiar and did not recognize them. The sudden, frozen stillness that overtook her during music. as if the notes triggered something she could not control. The days, she stared too long into empty space, her lips twitching, as if arguing with a voice no one else could hear. What had begun as the slow disintegration of the body was now climbing up the spine, creeping into the crown. The mercury painted each day onto her lips and cheeks in the form of vermilion had done its work. The lead rubbed into her skin with religious devotion had seeped deep into her bones. Her blood, her brain, she had, over decades, constructed a temple to eternal beauty, and now lived inside it like a prisoner. Mercury poisons the nerves, dulls the memory, and warps the senses. Lead corrodes thought, distorts emotion, and lays waste to reason. And for Elizabeth, who had painted these metals onto her skin for over 30 years, the symptoms came not as a surprise, but as an inevitability. She began to pace at night, not just a few turns about the chamber, but hours of endless motion, whispering half-thoughts into the velvet dark, fingers dragging along the stone walls like she was counting each step. She would stop suddenly, listening to sounds no one else heard. Sometimes she would laugh, not bitterly, but with the soft, dreamy laugh of a child. And sometimes she screamed violent, guttural screams that echoed through the palace halls, waking entire households. The guards outside her door learned to wait until silence returned before checking in. Her ladies stopped sleeping altogether, dozing in shifts, ready to calm her, to wipe her face, to sit beside her as she spoke to people who had been dead for 20 years. Her hallucinations became familiar visitors. Anne Boleyn, her mother, appeared first. Elizabeth would hold entire conversations with her, sometimes whispering questions, sometimes cursing her. On other nights, she would see her sister Mary, sitting at the edge of the bed with a face like ash, watching silently. Her father, Henry VIII, came often. Elizabeth would argue with him about legitimacy, about the crown, about women's power, about betrayal. Her voice would rise into shrill fury, and then she would collapse into sobs, begging for forgiveness. And then there were others, people no one could identify. Lovers, enemies, victims. She never said, she only murmured their names in the dark, and reached out with trembling hands that grasped at air. Her behavior during the day shifted as well. She grew suspicious, not cautiously, not diplomatically, but obsessively. She accused her cooks of poisoning her, demanded that every dish be tasted thrice. She accused her ladies of plotting to steal her jewelry. Or worse, her image. One morning, she had all the mirrors removed again. Not out of shame this time, but because she believed they were watching her, not reflections. She said, eyes, windows, mouths. The mirrors were trying to speak, and she did not like what they said. Elizabeth had always lived with the weight of conspiracy, but now every glance was a dagger, every whisper a plot. She locked her bedchambers at night with 3 separate bolts. She kept knives beneath her pillows. She had secret doors sealed. One of her oldest attendants once attempted to soothe her during a fit of panic, and Elizabeth struck her across the face with a golden goblet, screaming that she was Anne in disguise. The woman bled. The queen wept afterward, but the damage was done. She also began to destroy things. One afternoon, after a formal audience with a Spanish envoy, she tore apart the flower arrangements in her receiving room, scattering petals and branches across the floor. She crushed the roses beneath her slippers, muttering, "They lied to me." No one dared ask what she meant. She later burned her own letters, pages of handwritten messages to old friends, advisors, and perhaps even Robert Dudley, now long dead. She stood over the fire and fed them one by one, watching them curl and vanish in smoke. And still, she demanded to be painted each morning. Still, she asked to be dressed in her finest gowns. Still, she wore the jewels that pressed against festering skin. The rituals remained intact, even as her thoughts unraveled. Her body had been failing for years. But now, her mind joined the descent. And yet she clung to the mask. She still sat upon the throne. She still listened sometimes with eerie silence as advisors delivered state matters. She still signed documents with a hand that shook slightly, her signature growing thinner with each year. When she could no longer sleep, her physicians offered her potions, tinctures of poppy, wine laced with mandrake, powders scraped from the horns of stags. She tried them. Sometimes they worked, but often they sent her deeper into the nightmares. Her screams in those drugged sleeps were the worst, so loud they reached the guard posts. She would wake with her hands over her face, nails leaving scratches down her cheeks, as if trying to tear the skin away. "It's not mine," she would say. "This isn't my face." In lucid moments, she knew what was happening. She had always been intelligent, perhaps too intelligent to endure madness in ignorance. She once turned to her most trusted lady and asked, "How long have I been gone?" The girl said nothing. What could she say? Elizabeth nodded, as if that silence was an answer. Then she added, "Make sure they don't see me like this." And so they didn't. Her public appearances grew fewer. Her speeches were read by others. Her letters were dictated, then corrected. She was seen only in candlelight now, and only through veils of incense, paint, and ceremony. The woman was dissolving. The queen remained. That was the last magic she possessed. But behind the mask, in the quietest hours before dawn, the queen no longer knew where she ended, and the mask began. She would sit for hours, staring at the fire, mouthing words no one could hear, rocking slightly. Sometimes, the mask cracked. She would whisper, "I am the shadow," over and over again. Or worse, she would ask, "Where is Elizabeth? Where did I put her?" By the time she reached 70, her mind had become a haunted house. Rooms full of memories she could not open, windows to people she could not bear to see. And in the center, on a throne made of silver lies, sat the husk of a girl who had once sworn to be more than a wife, more than a woman, more than a name. She had become legend, but the cost of that legend was herself, and the legend was not finished with her yet. In the end, it was silence that filled her court, not the ceremonial quiet of reverence, not the taut hush of diplomacy, but a deeper, stranger kind of stillness. It began with her words, or rather, the absence of them, for Elizabeth, whose voice had once bent ministers to her will and shattered foreign alliances with a glance and a sentence, now found speech to be an unnatural thing, not painful, not forgotten, just foreign, like a skill she had learned in another life, another body. The courtiers noticed it first, the long pauses in council, the nods instead of answers, the strange, deliberate, blinking. She used to communicate consent, and then they began to realize that entire days would pass with her uttering nothing at all. The silence was not peaceful. It pressed on her attendants like a weight, filled the tapestries and carved panels with a pressure that made them afraid to breathe too loudly. They tiptoed around her chambers, their mouths dry, their eyes darting toward her, watching for some signal, some flicker of recognition or command. But Elizabeth had slipped behind the veil of quiet. And from there, she would not be coaxed. Some thought it was a final descent into madness. Others whispered that it was penance. But the truth, though none of them could speak it aloud, was that Elizabeth had nothing left to say. Her teeth were nearly all gone now. Pulled, or fallen. Lost to rot and fear. Her mouth had collapsed inward, giving her the look of a woman who had aged decades in mere months. The fabric wads once tucked into her cheeks to simulate fullness no longer stayed in place. Her tongue was often dry. Her lips cracked. Every attempt to speak resulted in slurred syllables. Half-formed words that embarrassed her far more than any physical disfigurement. She could no longer shape her thoughts into the music of command. And so she stopped trying. There was dignity. She believed in choosing silence over humiliation. But the silence spread. When she no longer spoke, her ministers learned to fill in the blanks. They brought her papers with the key decisions already made. Written in clear, bold hand, she would scan them with dull eyes. Nod once. And place her mark. Her signature, once strong and proud, filled with elaborate loops and flourishes, was now a series of shaking lines, sometimes unfinished, sometimes crooked. She signed with her left hand on some days, her right on others. No one asked why. No one dared. And still, the rituals of her image continued. Every morning, her ladies would arrive before dawn, carrying trays of white powder, scented cloth, fresh gloves, and the heaviest of her wigs. They knew better now than to speak. The Queen did not need words to command. A glance was enough. A breath, a tilt of the chin. They worked in quiet harmony, dabbing ointment over the sores, pressing ceruse into the ravaged skin, layering mercury-laced vermilion across her fading lips. The paint no longer adhered the way it once had. Her face wept through it, clear fluid from burst blisters, yellow from infection, pink from blood. But they layered it anyway, building the illusion over the raw truth until the Queen emerged. As always, perfect. The silence extended to her audiences. When she received foreign envoys or petitioners, it was as if she had become a figure carved from marble. She would sit in her throne, wrapped in brocade, and jewels dripping from fingers that trembled slightly, despite her effort to hide it. She would listen sometimes, nodding, sometimes closing her eyes, and then gesture for one of her secretaries to read the prepared response. The words still came from her, carefully written in the lonely hours of night. But they came through others now, spoken by men with clean mouths and strong voices. Elizabeth remained present, but only as a symbol, and the court accepted it. They had no choice. Those who had served her longest understood that to question the silence was to rupture something sacred. They remembered the Queen who danced in golden slippers, who sparred with Cecil in council, who answered Parliament's demands with a flick of her fan and a line of poetry. That Queen still lived, but only in memory. The woman before them now was not dead, not gone, but transformed. She had turned inward, becoming a relic that must be preserved, not engaged. Her ladies, however, bore the brunt of the silence. The younger ones cried at night, unnerved by the stillness, unsure how to serve a mistress who did not speak. The older ones adapted. They developed a kind of language, half gestures, half intuition. They could sense her moods from the way she blinked, the way she held her hands, the length of her breath before rising. When Elizabeth wept, which she did often now, they said nothing. They brought clean linen, wiped her face gently, and retouched the makeup with the patience of saints. When she trembled in the night, they placed warm stones at her feet and held her hand until the shaking stopped. No one asked her what haunted her dreams. Sometimes, she would sit for hours facing the wall, not sleeping, not meditating, just sitting. Her crown, now too heavy for her skull, was placed beside her on a cushion. Her robes, while still regal, hung from her shoulders like funeral drapery. She resembled not a queen, but a statue mourning her own reign. And in those moments, the ladies would leave her be, stepping quietly into the outer chambers where they spoke only in murmurs, their eyes haunted by what they had seen. One afternoon, she broke the silence. She was sitting by the hearth, her hands wrapped in linen, her head bowed. The fire had burned low. Ash spilled over the grate. Then, without looking up, she whispered, "They will not remember the silence, only the color." The words startled the maid at her side. She had not heard the queen speak in weeks. She knelt, but Elizabeth lifted one hand, fingers twitching. "Go," she said. "Let them think I smiled until the end." And after that, she spoke no more. The physician said little could be done. They prescribed potions to stimulate appetite. She refused them. They recommended bloodletting to ease the tension in her chest. She waved them away. They proposed leeches for the fever swelling in her jaw. She laughed, a quiet, rasping sound that made the room colder. "No more drains," she mouthed. "Only the sea." The days bled into each other. The queen no longer walked. She no longer dined. She sat, always upright, always in her chair by the fire, facing the windows that looked toward the Thames. Her mind was elsewhere. Her soul, perhaps, was waiting. And then came the final silence. She stopped opening her eyes. She breathed, shallow and slow. Her ladies painted her still, careful not to press too hard against skin that now tore like parchment. They braided her hair, what was left of it, and placed a golden net across her scalp. They tied ribbons at her wrists and perfumed her hands. She said nothing. They spoke to her as they worked, telling stories of her triumphs, her banquets, the laughter of summers past. She did not answer. She had become something more than mortal, a silence painted in gold and mercury, a queen whose words had shaped the fate of nations, now reduced to stillness, to presence, to myth. The body remained. The voice was gone. But the legend whispered louder than any cry. They had not seen her on her feet in many weeks. And yet on that bleak morning in February of the year 603, the queen rose. No one had helped her. No one had dared. They had entered her chambers as they always did, at dawn, walking softly across the rush-strewn floors, the air heavy with the scent of burning cedar and clove, prepared to resume the ritual, layering the mask, smoothing the flesh, disguising the wounds that refused to close. But Elizabeth was already standing, not dressed, not crowned, just standing barefoot in her night shift, her skin pale where it was not gray, her legs trembling like thin branches in winter wind. The Countess of Nottingham had died the night before. She had been one of the few who remained, one of the last to speak to Elizabeth not as a monarch, not as a legend, but as a woman. She had seen the mask applied and removed more times than she could count, had held Elizabeth's hand during Zeitzeras, had wiped her lips when they bled in secret. She had whispered reassurances in the queen's ear on nights when the pain left her shaking and silent. And now she was gone. Elizabeth had not wept. She had not raged. She had simply dismissed her ladies the night before and sat alone by the fire until morning. And then she stood. No one knew what to say. The silence that followed was deeper than reverence. It was fear. There was something unnatural in the way she swayed gently. Her eyes unfocused. Her lips moving without sound. The dressing chair stood ready. The brushes arranged. The powder open. But she did not sit. She walked, slowly, deliberately, one bare foot in front of the other, crossing the chamber toward the window. Her bones cracked audibly with each step. Her skin pulled tight across her jaw. The fabric of her nightgown was stained near the collar, where a lesion had opened during the night. She stood by the window, one hand resting on the stone sill, and her back to the room. No one dared speak. Then, without turning, she said, "Do not paint me today." Her voice was raw, more breath than sound. A voice unpracticed, unused. The ladies looked at one another in confusion. One stepped forward, bowed, low, and whispered, "Majesté, the court awaits your blessing at noon." Elizabeth did not move. "They will receive nothing." It was the first day in 45 years that Elizabeth appeared in her chamber without her royal face. She did not summon her physicians. She refused her breakfast. When they brought warm water and fresh linens, she waved them away. Instead, she walked slow laps around the chamber floor, her feet dragging softly over the stones, her gown trailing behind her like the veil of a funeral shroud. At some point, she sat cross-legged on a heap of cushions by the hearth, pulled a fur blanket around her shoulders, and went utterly still. They tried to move her later that evening. She screamed, not in words, but in a guttural, animal cry that startled even the guards beyond the chamber door. The ladies stumbled back, and Elizabeth fell silent again, curling in on herself, her eyes distant. She remained on that floor for days. Refused food, refused medicine, refused the crown. Her hair, once so carefully styled, grew tangled. Her hands, wrapped in linen, began to tremble constantly. When they brought her the royal mantle, she would not touch it. When they offered her the scepter, she laughed a dry, rasping sound that made one girl cry. "The crown is too heavy now," she whispered. "Let it lie where it fell." And so it did. Someone placed it on the velvet cushion beside the fire, where it remained untouched. A dull glint of gold in the flickering light. Still majestic. Still regal. But now a thing apart from her, as if she had laid down not just her title, but her very self. The silence grew thicker. She no longer reacted to music, no longer flinched at pain. When they whispered her name, she did not respond. But she spoke sometimes not to them, not to the living. She spoke to the shadows, to her mother. She said, "They remember your execution more than your beauty. Will they say the same of me?" To her father, "You carved me into this crown with your hands. You cannot complain now that I bleed under it." To Mary, "You died screaming. I have died slowly, and sometimes to no one at all." She whispered stories of what might have been: a child's name she never bore, a wedding dress she never wore, a kiss she never allowed herself to take. Her voice was thin and frayed, like the hem of a gown, worn too long. But each word landed like stone. The court did not know how to respond. Her ministers begged for clarity. The succession was uncertain. Parliament waited. The people waited. But Elizabeth would not name a successor. She would not answer the letters. She would not rise. She simply stared into the fire, as if it alone held the answer. Her body had begun to fold in on itself. The sores across her back had opened from the pressure of sitting in one position too long. Her breath rasped wetly. Her stomach refused, even broth. Her skin turned the color of parchment, with patches of dark gray along her neck and collarbone. When the ladies tried to move her to the bed, she struck at them with surprising strength. "I will not be lying down," she spat. "That is for the weak." So she sat, day after day. The Queen of England sat on the floor of her chamber, beside a fire slowly dwindling to ash, the crown at her side and no paint upon her face. And then, one evening, the whispering stopped. She did not speak. She did not blink. Her head leaned slightly to one side. Her fingers twisted in the fabric of her gown. Her ladies watched for hours. They held their breath, and when night passed into dawn, and she still had not moved, they sent for the Archbishop. He came and stood before her. Trembling, he asked her, softly, "Majesté, do you have words for us?" And though she did not open her eyes, her lips moved. They said she whispered one word, "James." Whether she meant the King of Scotland, the child of her rival, the heir she had long denied, no one could be certain. But it was the only name she gave. Later that night, her breath grew shallow. The ladies took her hand. One placed the crown gently upon the floor beside her feet. And there, on the cold stones of Richmond Palace, in the quiet shadow of the hearth, Elizabeth Tudor, the queen who would not bend, who would not bow, who refused to be seen as anything less than sovereign, fell still. She did not die in her bed. She died where she chose, on her own terms, with her mask unworn and her crown fallen, and the silence she left behind was heavier than any golden jewel she had ever worn. They had always believed that medicine smelled of healing herbs, oils, warm cloth, murmured prayers. But in the final season of Elizabeth's life, the scent of medicine became something far darker. It was the smell of iron and vinegar, the stench of rotting flesh soaked in camphor, the sharp, metallic tang of blood drained into basins. Her chamber, once perfumed with lavender and beeswax, now carried the odor of a room where the body had begun to give up, long before the soul agreed to follow. And the physicians, those pale, anxious men with trembling hands, had become less like healers and more like butchers working in a sacred tomb. Bloodletting was their answer to everything, to fevers, to swelling, to the trembling in her limbs, to the darkening patches on her neck. They believed illness was a corruption of humors trapped within the body, and only the release of blood could restore balance. And so, in the cold months of the year 603, the Queen's arms bore rows of small scars where knives had bitten into flesh again and again. The first cuts had been neat, made with care and ceremony. But as her health worsened, the physicians grew frantic, making deeper incisions, applying more leeches, drawing bowl after bowl of blood from a body that had nothing left to give. Her lips lost color. Her hands grew cold. Her mind drifted further from clarity. Yet still they insisted one more bleeding might calm the fever. One more leech might relieve the swelling in her jaw. There were nights when she fainted mid-procedure, slumping forward in her chair. Her skin, the color of wax. The ladies would catch her, lifting her gently, whispering to her, as though coaxing a frightened child from sleep. But she would not wake easily. Her breath would come shallow, almost imperceptible. They would rub her hands, pinch her arms, press warm stones to her feet. Sometimes she returned. Sometimes she drifted for hours like a soul hovering above her own body. And every time she resurfaced, the physicians would thank divine providence and propose yet another remedy. They feared her death, but feared her wrath more. She had outlived every threat and punished every betrayal. Even as her body failed, the force of her will remained terrifying. The skin infections became the next battlefield. The sores across her face and collarbone had grown deeper, some turning black around the edges. They were wounds that should have healed, but instead reopened each morning beneath the friction of cloth and the weight of cosmetics. The physicians, desperate to contain the corruption, began applying ointments made from mercury, vinegar, antimony, and powdered pearl. They believed the purity of pearls could draw impurities from the skin. Elizabeth had always loved pearls the way they glowed softly against her neck. The symbolism of purity they carried. Now she consumed them ground into paste, swallowed them in wine, let them be smeared across wounds that burned beneath the touch. The paste stung so deeply that even Elizabeth, who had endured childbirth-like pain from dental abscesses, who had stood, unflinching as her ladies painted over raw lesions, winced when it touched her skin. She gripped the chair until her knuckles whitened, breathing through clenched teeth, her face tightening into something fierce and nearly animal. But she never resisted. She asked for the pearls again and again, whispering, "If beauty kills me, let it kill me with the things I loved." Her ladies cried while applying it. They watched the paste crackle as it dried, tightening across her cheek like a brittle shell. They heard her breath tremble when it finally hardened. Yet they followed her command. Even suffering could not part her from the rituals of her image. When the pearl paste failed, the physicians turned to stranger cures. One proposed heating irons and pressing them lightly against the ulcers to draw out the bad humors. Elizabeth refused only once. When another physician recommended applying the boiled fat of newborn lambs, she said nothing. They covered her shoulders in the warm, greasy salve, whispering that it would soothe her. Instead, it burned her open sores until she gasped, fingers clawing at the chair arms. The salve was removed. The physician was dismissed, but the wound beneath never recovered. Rumors spread, as rumors always do, through kitchens, corridors, guard posts. They whispered that the queen was rotting from the inside, that her skin had turned against her, that she bled from places no one could see, and worst of all, that she had begun to seek cures outside the realm of physicians into the realm of superstition. Some said she asked an astrologer to craft a potion using distilled moonlight. Others claimed she prayed to saints whose names she had never spoken before. A few believed she sent for women who practiced old village magic-wise, women whose hands knew herbs and charms older than England itself. One such woman was brought in secret through a side gate at dusk. Wrapped in a cloak, she carried jars of dried plants, roots, and powders. She examined the queen's face with solemn eyes, and then she whispered something that made Elizabeth's chin lift with a kind of broken dignity. "You have already begun the journey inward. I can only ease your passing." Elizabeth ordered her removed from the palace by dawn. But the darkest rumor, the one even the ladies dared not speak aloud, was the use of blood. There had long been a superstitious belief in England that the vitality of youth could be absorbed by the old through certain rites and tinctures. Some whispered that Elizabeth had been given draughts mixed with the blood of young men, that she drank them with closed eyes, trembling hands, and a desperation so deep it left her shaking afterward. Whether true or not, the rumor reflected the truth. No one wished to confront the queen's body was failing, and her fear of decay had reached beyond reason. Her nights became fever-ridden journeys. She lay awake, sweating through her linens, her breath rattling, her skin shimmering with the sheen of infection. The ladies placed cool cloths on her forehead. They whispered prayers. They held her hair back when nausea forced her to retch. And still she asked them not to remove her paint, not to uncover the face beneath. Even in delirium, she clung to the mask. Identity had fused with appearance. Without the paint, she was no longer the queen. Without the queen, she feared she would die. Her bed remained empty. She refused to lie in it. Instead, she curled on her cushions beside the fire. Her body angled in a way that made the pain in her back less sharp, and every morning, they lifted her gently from where she had slept, changed the linens beneath her, and tended quietly to the wounds she no longer acknowledged. Each day the masks became heavier, the gloves thicker, the wigs larger. Elizabeth was disappearing behind her own armor. Her body was shrinking, but the image she maintained only grew more elaborate. It was as though she was building a monument to herself from the outside inward, layer upon layer, even as the core crumbled. Then, in the first week of March, she whispered to one of her ladies, "No more physic." It was the closest she came to surrender. The physicians protested. They begged her to drink the broths and tinctures. She turned away. They argued that bloodletting might ease her fever. She closed her eyes. They suggested more pearl paste. She shook her head weakly. The legend had chosen to end her own treatment. But the mask remained. Her ladies painted her one last time, not for a council, not for an audience, but because she asked for it. Her voice was thin, almost childlike. "Make me as I was," she said. They worked slowly, reverently. They patted the open sores. They layered the white lead with trembling hands. They shaped her lips with vermilion. They placed the wig of gold and silver curls upon her head. They dressed her in a gown of white satin, a gown she had worn only once decades before. And when they finished, she looked peaceful, not alive, but not yet dead. Suspended, waiting. The pearl paste had not saved her. The bloodletting had not saved her. The charms and prayers had not saved her. Nothing could. Elizabeth had fought the inevitable with every tool, every poison, every ritual her age could offer. But now, the body had given its final warning. The skin had stopped healing. The fevers no longer broke. The breath rattled like wind through empty windows. She had become the ghost of her own legend. And the ghost was almost ready to leave. They painted her one last time. It was not a gesture of respect. It was necessity. Her body cold now, still now, collapsed into itself on the floor. Where she had chosen to die was no longer a woman, no longer a queen, but something else entirely, something they could not display as it was. So they scrubbed the rot from her cheeks with cloth soaked in vinegar, peeled dried blood from the corners of her mouth with wetted linen, and opened the final jar of cirrus. The same poisonous white paste that had consumed her in life was now reapplied to preserve the illusion in death. Thick, almost chalky now. It coated the gray-mottled skin like plaster, sealing the weeping sores, covering the crumbling scars that had made a map of her final years. The embalmers worked in silence, heads bowed, not out of reverence but caution. The smell rising from her was overwhelming. Infection had taken its toll long before her last breath. The inside of her had already begun to spoil. Her face, once stripped of paint, had been shocking even to the most hardened hands. One of the embalmers, a man who had prepared plague victims, vomited behind a curtain and never returned. The mouth had collapsed entirely inward. A black hollow, where teeth had once been. The lips were split. The gums open and dark. Her skin bore the ruins of a battlefield. The sores had not healed. Some were raw. Others encrusted with yellow decay. There were burns from ointments, welts from poultices, deep cuts that had scabbed over and split again and again. And her eyes, when they finally closed them, had been sunken. Bloodshot. Unfocused. One still half open, as if reluctant to let the world go. There was no dignity in the flesh. Only history. Brutal. Silent. Indéniable. The wig had to be sewn to her scalp. Her natural hair was nearly gone. Thin as cobwebs. Clinging in greasy patches to a scalp scalded from decades of mercury. Lye. And wine tinctures meant to stimulate growth. They placed curls of horsehair and goat hair beneath the lace and powdered it to perfection. Her jewels were pinned into the wig to distract the eye from the unnatural stillness of the face. Her body, ravaged by abscesses and ulcers, was packed with linen, soaked in balsam and herbs. But it was not enough to stop the stench. Layers of velvet and brocade were wrapped tightly around her limbs to contain the decay. Not to dress her with elegance. When they finally slid the great golden gown over her frame, it moved stiffly like clothing, a mannequin carved from wax. They worked through the night, and when they were done, they stood back and looked upon what they had made. She was beautiful, a marble ghost, an eternal queen. Her skin was smooth. Her lips were gently painted. Her jaw held shape again, propped from within. Her cheeks were blushed. Her eyelids shimmered with the faintest gold dust. Her throat bore a necklace of rubies, so large they pulled her head slightly to one side. And on her white-gloved hands, fingers too long, too thin now, were rings that glimmered under the candlelight, like the eyes of creatures hiding in the dark. She did not look like the Elizabeth they had buried beneath powders and perfume these last decades. She looked like the woman in the portraits, the myth. And so they laid her out. The Queen's body was placed in the presence chamber of Richmond, beneath the great canopy, resting on a bier of blackened wood, draped in gold and crimson, with candles at every corner and guards stationed in silence. Thousands would come to see her, to weep, to bow, to whisper that she looked serene, that she did not look a day older than 60, that the Queen had died a dignified death. And not one of them, not one would have guessed that beneath the silk, beneath the ruff, beneath the painted lips, was a body already disintegrating. No one knew how her spine had twisted in the final days, how her belly had turned to stone from infection, how her skin had split open on her thighs where pressure wounds had festered. All they saw was the dream, the ghost who had ruled them. The funeral was immense. On the 28th of April, in the year 603, they carried her through London. The weather was cold, the sky heavy, and the streets were lined with tens of thousands. They had not seen her in years. Not truly. And here she was again, Majestits, untouched, unmoved by time. The effigy atop the coffin was crafted in her likeness, wearing a crown. Her body, however, lay deep beneath layers of waxed cloth and floral offerings meant to dull the odor. They could not embalm her in the true sense. Her condition made it impossible. So they displayed the image instead. A corpse in name only. A performance extended into eternity. When they lowered her into the tomb at Westminster Abbey, beside her half-sister Mary, they sealed away more than a monarch. They buried a legacy of silence, of secrets, of a body turned traitor to its soul. The tomb was carved with Latin inscriptions and images of virtue and grace. There were no mentions of infection, no suggestion of lead, no echoes of the screams that had torn through her chambers in those last years. Her legacy was set in stone, the Virgin Queen, the woman who brought peace, the Gloriana who never bent, never broke. But those who addressed her knew the truth. They remembered the sores that had bled through silk, the rags soaked in her sweat, the scabs painted over with trembling fingers. They remembered the nights she spoke to the dead, the days she sat unmoving on the floor, her lips too swollen to speak, her eyes clouded with fever. They remembered the scent of her breath, the trembling in her hands, the sound of her voice when it still had breath enough to whisper, "Make me beautiful." They kept their silence, because in the end, the myth mattered more than the woman. And history is written by those who keep their mouths shut. But the body beneath the crown, the corpse painted with poison one final time, was not a myth. She was real. She suffered. And she never let them see her break. Even in death, she wore her mask. Because Elizabeth was not allowed to be mortal. She was the dream England needed her to be. Even if that dream killed her,